I wanted to share, I guess, some of the reflections that I had while I was reading this chapter. But uh, before I begin, I do want to thank the Roanoke Library System for even allowing me to come and be a part of this book club. I always get excited about coming to Roanoke. I guess making a pilgrimage in my mind to Roanoke, this being the hometown of Oliver Hill, who is a hero of mine. I'm also just really, I guess, grateful that you all are kind of doing this work and have chosen to really make a brave and intentional decision to read Stamped from the Beginning. I don't know of many communities that are making that type of commitment, and I think that's just very commendable. Now, when I was reading Stamped from the Beginning, uh, you know, it's honestly an overwhelming text. I think there's a lot. There is a lot coming at you, and I know for me, I think one of the more challenging things was really seeing, I guess, my family's history kind of play out um, over these pages. Constantly having to think about the racist ideas that members of my family continuously had to confront, and in many cases still confront to this day. I am a millennial. I'm an elder millennial. I think now we're kind of differentiating ourselves. If you can remember a plug-in phone, so I am an elder millennial. Uh, but I'm also the great grandson of enslaved Virginians. And when I say great grandson, I'm referring to my mother's grandparents. So my mom, who's very much alive, is a granddaughter of enslaved Virginians. And so when we talk about this history, this is still a very recent history. When we talk about the Great Migration, my parents only in recent decades have returned from New York back to the South. My grandmother was a domestic until she married my grandfather, who swore to her that she would never have to work for another white family again. And he kept that promise to her after they were married. And so there are a lot of different things throughout the book that you're seeing really be contextualized, I think, in a really profound way. Um, and I think something else that was really challenging for me as I was reading this book is that I was having to confront my own racist ideas. Right? We've all kind of grown up in this environment. There are things that we've all internalized consciously and unconsciously. And so, reflecting on the times where I've been an assimilationist and really striving to become more of an anti-racist is something that I found myself constantly doing as I was reading this book. Um, so Dr. Kendi forces us to expand our conceptions of racism and anti-racism and critically reassess what we've long held to be true. I was first introduced to anti-racism I would say about 20 years ago. I was in middle school, but I was reading a book. Many of you have probably read it. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and other conversations about race. She recently reissued a 20th anniversary edition, but this was the first time I'd ever heard the term anti-racism, and it really has stuck with me to this day. Dr. Tatum essentially describes the default as racism. We're all surrounded by racism. We're constantly encountering racism. She talks about racism being a conveyor belt that you would find at the airport. And if you are an active racist, you are running in the same direction as that conveyor belt. And so when we think of active racists, those are the Klan members, the very vocal segregationists we learn about in history textbooks. They're running in the same direction as the conveyor belt. A passive racist is simply standing on the conveyor belt doing nothing. You're being taken to the same direction as the active racist. And really that's a reflection on what it's like to exist in many places around the world. You don't have to really do anything to perpetuate racism. You just have to go about your day. Which Dr. Tatum calls on us to do is to become active anti-racists. You're running in the opposite direction of that conveyor belt. You're actively doing things that dismantle racism and promote um, anti-racist values and outcomes. And so I think Kendi's kind of breakdown, I'm glad I looked at the terms because I don't have to get into the terms. I think Kendi's breakdown of racist ideas and anti-racist ideas is a incredible compliment to the work that Dr. Tatum has done, and I'm really grateful that he's completed this work. I've had the opportunity to hear him speak, I think, 3 times. Once at a conference a couple of years ago. He was in Charlottesville at the Virginia Festival of the Book, which my organization hosts, and he talked about there needing to be new founders. If America truly aspires to be an anti-racist nation, then we have to uphold anti-racist founders. He began listing different people in history, many of whom are covered in this text, who could serve as the founders or the refounders of our country for each generation. Now, while I was reading, I also couldn't help but think about my hometown, Farmville, a place Du Bois described in 1897 as being, quote, thoroughly Virginian in character, easygoing, gossipy, and conservative, end quote. And I can tell you all that Farmville it hasn't changed a lot, honestly, in the last, I guess, like 100 so years. It really hasn't. Now, during his career, at this time in his career, Du Bois was about 30 years old. He was an Atlanta University professor, and as you all read, he was teetering between anti-racist and racist / assimilationist thought. He was working on the Philadelphia Negro, and he was also conducting annual scientific investigations of Southern black life, which is why he was in Farmville. He felt that the black community in Farmville could be representative for the larger state. For those of you who aren't aware, Farmville is kind of located right in the middle of Virginia, college town, agricultural yet slightly industrialized location. His Farmville findings, which perhaps included him observing or even interviewing my great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, were published in 1898 as a bulletin of the U.S. Department of Labor. And it was entitled The Negroes of Farmville, Virginia, a Social Study. Now, after spending 2 months studying and assessing our conjugal condition, births, deaths, schools, illiteracy, occupations, wages, economics of the family, and group life. And these were the report's titled sections. After spending 2 months in the summer assessing these subjects, Du Bois concludes, a study of a community like Farmville brings to light facts favorable and unfavorable, and conditions good, bad, and indifferent. One thing, however, is clear, and that is the growing differentiation of classes among Negroes, even in small communities. And he goes on to say that this is a, quote, most natural and encouraging result of 30 years of development. It seems fair to conclude, after an impartial study of Farmville conditions, that the industrious and property-accumulating class of the Negro citizens best represents, on the whole, the general tendencies of the group. At the same time, the mass of sloth and immorality is still large and threatening. Now, this is pretty fascinating, I would say. It's an interesting conclusion. These are some of the key excerpts from his findings there. And Dr. Kendi, I think, would undoubtedly describe this as an assimilationist conclusion, stemming from the racist idea that freedom had facilitated black adoption of civilized values, norms, and character. Right. Now, Du Bois is engaged in class racism, right, where immorality, crime, and laziness is due to black underdevelopment during slavery. He remains, however, optimistic and encouraged by the fact that 30 years of quote-unquote development has resulted in a growing class of industrious blacks, which is our general tendency. Now, an anti-racist conclusion would connect black poverty to racial discrimination, not black morality. An anti-racist conclusion would correlate black achievement with Reconstruction policies, not temporal distance from slavery. Studying and seeing Du Bois' intellectual growth and evolution, for me, honestly makes him even more noteworthy. And he's also a much more compelling and relatable figure than the man I first learned about in grade school. You know, seeing his progression in thought, I honestly found it pretty encouraging to know that we all have that ability to grow in our thinking and to evolve in the way we're processing these challenging and difficult issues. I actually went back and reviewed what I was taught about Du Bois. And again, I grew up in an NAACP family, a multi-generational NAACP family. So I knew he founded the NAACP. That's something we were told every Black History Month. He founded the NAACP, and he was the first black person to graduate from Harvard. Those are kind of the key facts. But in Virginia right now, this is what 11th grade students are taught. W.E.B. Du Bois believed that education was meaningless without equality. He supported political equality for African Americans by helping to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's the bullet. That's it. So here we go. All right. So W.E.B. Du Bois believed that education was meaningless without equality. He supported political equality for African Americans by helping to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's the only thing students right now who are attending public school in Virginia are required to know about W.E.B. Du Bois, which is clearly unreflective of all that most of you have just read about his life and his evolution and all that he contributed to society. I was surprised, and I'd forgotten this, but they do also include Ida B. Wells and Booker T. Washington. And so those are kind of the three kind of thought leaders that are being taught right now in Virginia's public schools. Ida B. Wells Barnett, it says that she led an anti-lynching crusade and called on the federal government to take action. So that's even less than W.E.B. Du Bois. Despite the fact that she was kind of the main challenger, the anti-racist thought leader of her generation, she did more than many of the men we typically learn about in school, yet is kind of relegated to this one sentence in our standards. And then Booker T. Washington, not to be forgotten, he believed the way to equality was through vocational education and economic success. He accepted social separation. So those are the ways these three figures are being taught right now in our public schools. And I'm saying this because this is probably my main soapbox. I've spent most of my careers thus far really advocating for changes in the way we teach this history, specifically civil rights history. I worked for several years as a museum educator in a civil rights museum. We need to change the top-down narrative that is taught about civil rights and focus on the local movements, the simultaneous local movements that were occurring across the country. We have to talk more about, obviously, the women who were integral to the movement, but also the young women. The museum, Moton, where I previously worked in my hometown's Civil Rights Museum, tells the story of Barbara Johns, who I think more people are beginning to learn about. That she was 16 years old in 1951 when she led a strike and then called Oliver Hill to come to Farmville and be their attorney. And they became plaintiffs in Brown v. Board of Education. 75% of the plaintiffs in Brown v. Board of Education came from this strike that she organized as a 16-year-old 4 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. We also have to kind of change this narrative that this history of racism only exists in the South, and that this isn't an international problem, really. Anti-blackness is global. And I think something, too, that Kendi is able to really highlight is that these civil rights victories um, would have likely been impossible without the international pressure that the United States faced. The Kennedy administration was being embarrassed internationally. The events that were happening, of just a few short miles from here, were being used as propaganda to show the hypocrisy of the United States. And so we have to put this history within this larger global context and show how all of these movements around the world were affecting what was happening here at home. But after reading Kendi, I would also really encourage a reassessment of all the figures we learn about in school, and really sit down and begin to think about. And this is something that I'm having to wrestle with right now. But really think about who were the assimilationists. I think we, for the most part, know who the segregationists were. We're really figuring out who were the assimilationists and who were the anti-racists. And then, with that knowledge, determining, in whose footsteps we aspire to follow. I think this is going to be pivotal, and I think it's key for young people to have those figures to look to. So those were some of my, main reflections. Again, there's a lot I could go into, but I had a chance to see the questions ahead of time. So I know there's going to be a lot covered. But I don't know, I'm happy, to maybe take some questions right now. I have some ears. We do. So we've had some conversations, and as you know, there is a I guess it's called a commission that we support as Virginia Humanities being a state agency. So these conversations are being had, but I'm curious to see what the final outcomes are going to be. Mm. Yeah, and the schedule is available online. It lists I believe 5 cities they'll be visiting before the commission concludes. So I don't know if you all have been following the commission. So there's a commission. I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's the Commission for the Study of African American History Education, I think. And it is a pretty impressive group of historians and museum leaders. There's also a parallel group of educators, K-12 educators, who are working to develop, an accompanying curriculum that can be shared across the state. So those are efforts that are ongoing. Yeah, so I was surprised to see Dr. Kendi talk about mass resistance, and he didn't go into great detail about it, but it was honestly something that growing up, I think my generation didn't learn about. We weren't told the stories of what had occurred. I can tell you when I began to connect the dots. So for those of you who may not know, I figure most people do, but in 1959, Prince Edward County shuttered its public school system rather than integrate, and the schools were closed for 5 years until another Supreme Court decision was handed down that reopened them. That wasn't discussed growing up. I was in a undergraduate summer course on constitutional law when I really discovered the history, because my professor at the time showed us a documentary, and I recognized people in the documentary. And of course, I immediately had a lot of questions, but it wasn't something that was discussed. Now, today, the museum has been open for about almost 20 years now, and in 2013, it reopened after a major renovation, and there's definitely been a shift in the conversation about this history, but it still is a challenge for most. I have relatives who I don't talk to about it because I know it would be difficult for them to discuss. And I think people in many ways are still recovering from that experience and the trauma that they felt as a child being deprived of an education for so long. Barbara Johns. So yeah, Barbara John with an S. Um, and we've seen a huge shift in recent years around her. Even the Attorney General building in Richmond is now named the Barbara Johns building. The Civil Rights Memorial in 2008 features her likeness. There's now a portrait of her inside of the executive mansion. And Virginia has a holiday. You don't get off, but there is a holiday on the books commemorating Barbara. I think the next step is getting it to be like a paid leave holiday. That would be important, I think. But um, that's some narrative shifting that's happening. I have no idea. I have no involvement whatsoever. Yeah. Oh, there's the actual bibliography. And I guess I'll just add, and the reason I even originally brought up Barbara Johns because she was someone when I talk about like really going back in time and trying to assess who the anti-racists were, who the assimilationists were. I see her as an anti-racist, and I see her being confronted by many of the adults in her community who were assimilationists. And despite the resistance that she faced and her fellow students faced, she decided to move forward with this action. And honestly, when Oliver Hill met with them, um, he had to convince them that integration was the best next step. These students. I mean, if you look at kind of Du Bois and his thought process from assimilationist to anti-racist to I guess you could say anti-racist separatists. Um, these students, at least the leaders who were organizing the strike, they were determined to simply have a school that was equal, and that was all black. And they loved their teachers, and they said their teachers were extraordinary. And in many cases, their teachers were better trained than the teachers in the all-white schools. If you think about kind of the glass ceiling for black educators, um, they were going to Columbia and Cornell to receive their advanced degrees because the state refused to allow them to attend graduate school in Virginia, but would pay for them to go out of state. So these teachers said, okay, we're going to go to the best schools we can find, and we're going to make Virginia pay for it if they won't admit us into their graduate programs. Mm-hmm. 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 Right, 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 right. Yep. Mm-hmm. Right, right. No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, and to still think that rather than allow these educators to attend school in their home state, they would provide these scholarships for them to leave. I mean, just the very thought of that is kind of incomprehensible to me. Hmm. Yep. 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 No, I agree with you 100%. Yeah, that was yeah, 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 50s and early 60s. My thoughts are I don't have any thoughts. I haven't read it yet. Um, but I know Ken. Kristen Green. Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County is another book. Um, so Ken is going to be at the Virginia Festival of the Book, and I'm moderating his panel. So I have a month to read it. Kristen Green, and Kristen is a friend of mine, and I don't know if I guess she became a friend of mine during the process of writing this book. We didn't grow up together despite being in the same hometown and not too many years apart. Um, but she attended the Segregation Academy when the public schools closed. Um, or her family founded the Segregation Academy. She attended years later, not knowing why the school was founded or that her grandfather was involved in closing the schools. And she does kind of a community investigation, but also kind of an internal family investigation of what happened and her family's role in this really difficult period in history. Hmm. Hmm. Right, right. The road to healing. Hmm. It's about the lobbying efforts to get that scholarship fund um, established, and that story is still ongoing in a lot of ways.